Good morning, everyone. Good to see you all. It is going to be my pleasure to introduce Dr. Frank Harwood. He is currently the Deputy Commissioner for the Division of Fiscal and Administrative Services at the Kansas State Department of Education. His primary role is to oversee the financial aspects of the agency, including the budget for KSDE and the distribution of state aid to schools. He's also the legislative liaison for the agency. Before joining KSDE, Dr. Harwood taught high school biology, chemistry, and physics, and coached at Perry Lecompton and served as assistant high school principal at Leavenworth. He was a junior high school principal, IT director, and chief operations officer at Lawrence. He has served as superintendent a total of 12 years, first in Bellevue, Nebraska, and DeSoto, Kansas, accumulating over 30 years of experience in the public education field. Dr. Harwood received a bachelor's degree in secondary science education from the University of Kansas and earned his master's degree in curriculum and instruction. He attended Washburn University, where he obtained his building and district licensure and received his doctorate from the University of Nebraska, Omaha. It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you Dr. Frank Harwood.
All right, good morning, and thank you for the really warm welcome. So far, I only have one complaint, and that's when Rylan reached out, said, come talk to our chamber. It's like, as a superintendent, I've talked to plenty of chambers. I mean, in DeSoto, I had 4 different chambers to work with, so I'm thinking, well, this is just a regular chamber meeting. And then I read the list of speakers in the past, and it's like, oh, wait a second, this is something a little bit different. So now I'm a little intimidated to make sure I have that. I can guarantee, I will try to be informative, but I've heard Rex Buchanan speak before, and I am not that entertaining. So I hope that's not the bar you were looking for. So today, what I'm going to talk a little bit about are just different issues going on in education. So most of it, we talked about legislative, this was from the legislative part, so we'll do a little bit of a legislative update. Mostly I'll kind of see if there are questions you have about that. So as I said, I've taught for 9 years. I do know some things about classroom management, so if you get disruptive, I can work on that. But the other thing is that it's also important that you ask questions when they're relevant, because sometimes I'll miss something. So I don't have any problems with just speaking up and saying, okay, can we get more information about that? I will try to keep us on time and know that what I want to get to by the end. So if I say, hey, we're going to talk about that later, I probably plan to talk about that later as long as we're running out of time. So to get started, there's probably a lot of debate and not necessarily a lot of understanding about just how education is really governed. And so this comes up a lot, and so Representative Schmoy hears this all the time, and so does Board Member O'Brien about staying in your lane. It comes up all the time. So let's try to figure out what the lanes are, and quite frankly, it's less lanes than, I guess, well-worn paths, and sometimes they crisscross. So that's where we're at. So the Kansas Constitution spells out in Article 6 about public education in Kansas. And so the first part is that the legislature will provide for the intellectual, educational, and vocational and scientific improvement. So the important part about this is that this was ratified in the 60s. So before that, this wasn't there. And at that time, public education evolved in the United States very, very locally. So there was a state superintendent, and there were county superintendents, but local boards were, a lot of times certainly in the early 1900s, were a lot of times the primary elected officials in some areas. So had a lot of control locally. And so that's where Kansas started. It was really a local control state, and some of that's still there. So the legislature also provide for the State Board of Education. So the legislature has to create the State Board of Education. Some people talk about the State Board of Education as the 4th branch of government because it does have self-executing powers. But the next one is local public schools are under general supervision. So I get calls regularly from parents trying to complain about what's going on in the school, and we should make the school do something. The State Department of Education has very limited authority to tell a local school district to do much of anything. And so we get, like, my kids being picked on, or the teacher did this, like, you need to talk to your local, first you need to talk to the superintendent or the principal or the school board. We don't do anything with personnel in local school boards, school districts. And so that's an important part, that there is still a great deal of local control. The legislature sets, let's go to the next one. The legislature shall make suitable provisions for funding. And so there are rules around funding that districts have to follow. There are rules around accreditation and some other things that districts have to follow. But other than that, local school districts get to make a lot of the choices. So then KSD is kind of in the middle of all this. All right, so that's kind of where we we have to work with. We take what the State Board of Education does, and we take what the legislature does, and my role from mostly from a fiscal standpoint is helping districts navigate that. So in July, I spend most of my time working with districts and their budgets, trying to make sure that they meet their revenue neutral rate requirements, make sure they meet their publication requirements, and then they're looking at how do you, unlike cities and counties, all of the, except for capital outlay, all of the funds are capped by state law. So when you're talking about those mill levies for school districts, there's a law that says this is how much that can be, and then you set a mill levy to get that amount of money. Unlike cities and counties, a lot of times when you have those mill levy caps, so we do it backwards from cities and counties for the most part. So there's a lot to that, understanding those things. So that's what we're doing now. So the other thing that I didn't have on this PowerPoint, but I'll talk a little bit about, is that this is how it's set up in Kansas. We get a lot of questions right now about, well, what about the federal role? And I could point to where the U.S. Constitution talks about public education, but it doesn't. So, and if you know how the U.S. Constitution works, is anything that's not in the Constitution is left to the states. So now the federal role typically has been funding. And the way they use funding is to incent or discourage behaviors. That's how you use funding. If you don't have any legal control, then you do grants to try to get people to do something you want, or you say, if you want this money, you have to do this thing. So that's how that works. There's a lot of federal funds. That's true in all of the areas, not just education. And so there's a lot of talk about about funding. So you may have heard that I think on June 28th, we got told that about $42.9 million in federal funding wasn't going to show up on July 1st when it was supposed to for schools across the state. So now that's been released. We haven't gotten all the allotments yet, so districts don't know what their share is. But that's got, so that we went through that with several rounds of pauses, and education that's not just true in education. Healthcare certainly has been there, especially public health has been in that situation. So that's going on all over the place. At this point, all of the funding that was supposed to be coming to school districts for 25-26 has been released. We just don't necessarily know the amounts yet. Well, hopefully we're supposed to get them on Monday, and we'll see. So that's what we're working on there. The other question, just real quick, is about the elimination of the U.S. Department of Education. And so what would that do? And that depends. Some of the largest amounts of federal funding that come to the state have been there since before the Department of Education was there. So I think the U.S. Department of Education was from like 1989. So it really wasn't that long ago, maybe 79. It wasn't that long ago. So if they eliminate the Department of Education, those funding sources could go back to where they were before there was one. It depends. Now, this is where you get into this whole argument about it was established by Congress, it can only be abolished by Congress, so those are the things that are going on there. Most of the largest amount of federal funding we receive in Kansas is actually not from the Department of Education, but from USDA as part of the federal free lunch program. That's about half of our $600 million in federal funds that come to the state every year. So the next largest part is for special education through IDEA. That's been around since 1972, much longer than the department's been there. Talk of that would go back to HHS. The concern is there anybody at HHS that knows anything about special education now? Also, even if all the funding stays, the interruption could be difficult, especially from cash flow and those kind of things. So it might be fine if the Department of Education goes away, but it also will probably be disruptive for some period of time if that happens. But again, it should take congressional action. We're going to go from there. So any questions just about the, then I'm going to, I think the next thing I'm going to do is jump into the state board a little bit. So anything else, any questions about that? But especially about the federal stuff, I'm not planning to talk about that much anymore. All right, so State Board of Education. So I was going to start off by saying, do you know who your state board member is? But, well, you should know because she just got introduced. Connie O'Brien is a state board member for District 4, which incorporates this area. The thing that I think is important for people to understand about state board members is there are 10 of them across the entire state. They are elected in a general election. So they represent 10 times more people than a state senator does, who in turn represents about 3 or 4 times more than a state representative does. So they represent a lot of people. And you'll notice that Kathy Hopkins, kind of like, I mean, it's a little bit like Congressional District 1. It's a big chunk of the state. Connie is because of just density of population, gets a little geographically smaller area. But again, there are 10 seats, that's what it is. And they get divided up every 10 years, just like all the other districts do based on population, trying to make sure that it's equal representation. So that's one of the things I think is interesting. Now, most people don't know what the state board does. They set policy. Their major areas of policy are around accreditation and assessment, and graduation rates. Those kinds of things are what they do. They don't have any control over funding. Funding is from the legislature. And so the two of them really, the legislature and the state board, really need to work together. I will say that has not been as smooth as it could be in recent years. I think it's kind of gone back and forth with different things. So sometimes if I go to a state board, I'm talking to a state board member about something that they would like to see done. I talk to a legislator about something they would like legislator say, you ran for the wrong office because what you're trying to fix is actually somebody else's responsibility. And so there's a lot of that goes on. And yeah, so we do the best we can with it as we move forward. So the state board's motto or goal is that Kansas leads the world in the success of each student. So this is one of those things that's changed, and I'll kind of go back to, everybody remember No Child Left Behind? Okay. So the problem with that is that when you try to enact a law like that, it never works the way you think it does. So for those of you who are on legislative bodies, you understand that, hey, we have this really good idea, but when you actually get it written into legal framework, a lot of times it doesn't do what you thought it would do. And No Child Left Behind was one of those things. As an educator, the kind of shameful part about that is that it took what I think was not a great law to get us to focus on each individual student versus hiding behind grade averages. So one of the things you talk about, DeSoto, I was at DeSoto for 7 years. DeSoto has his second highest state assessment averages in the state. So, but there are students in DeSoto that are not performing well. And so for a long time, districts or schools were able to say, hey, our averages are good, but somebody has to be below average. And somebody may not be doing that. So No Child Left Behind helped with that. And so this is a little bit of this impetus from the state board is we need to be talking about every student, because even if 5% of the students aren't performing at grade level, do you want your student to be that 5%? And that's the question we try to ask now. So a little bit about that. So now we're going to move on to legislative updates. So there were a number, the legislature met for 89 days, which is about typical. They ended on April 11th. So even though the 89 days, typically it's 90 days, they're kind of limited to that, but they got done really early this year, okay? Because they went straight through without any breaks. So the problem with that was they adjourned before the consensus estimates were done. And the consensus revenue estimates are, okay, so you passed a budget, do you have money for it? It's kind of the question that goes on. So the good news was when the consensus revenue came out, 2025 was up 1.6 and 2026 was up 2.2. But if you remember the 2024 legislation, they did a bunch of tax cuts. And so the 1.6 that was up is still 4.4% below what it was the year before. And so the good news is there's about $3 billion in reserves that the state has. And so if you have $3 billion more than you need, you should probably cut taxes. However, if you have that in reserve and you start spending reserves, you know what happens? They're gone at some point. So the thing that folks need to be paying attention to is that this year's budget is between $700 and $800 million more than the revenues budgeted. Now that could change if revenues come in higher, that could actually be taken care of. But if everything goes by estimates, in 2029 there will be a $730 million deficit. And you don't have to go very far back in Kansas to remember what happens when the state has deficits. So again, if you have a bunch of extra money in reserves, cutting taxes is a good thing. But just like you're spending out of your savings account, you have to have a way to stop it at some point or you're out of money. So that's what the legislature is going to face for the next couple of years is, what do we do to either increase revenues or decrease spending? And my experience with legislators, they really like to say yes. And yes is easier to say to increase spending and decrease taxes. It's hard to say yes to decrease spending and increase taxes. But that's what happens. And so, this is not, not a partisan thing. It's just one of those things about, if you are in control of funding and spending, you can only spend what you have. And if you want something better, you may have to get more money, which is increased taxes. And at the end of the day, sometimes you get what you pay for. And so if you don't want any taxes, you should not want any services. That's just the way things work. So that's what the legislation, that's what they're facing in the next few years budgetarily. So there were a whole bunch of bills that impacted education. I will say that this year, and Representative Schmoy served on both House Education and House K-12 budget, and so she knows about this. This year, for the first time in probably 6 years, education policy was separated from education budget. We had been going with this one big bill that had like 9 policy things, and then the funding of it is actually separated. Of these, there were not tons of changes. One of the big things that will come about for, let's see, which one is it? For bond issues. So if you've had a bond issue like in April, actually in the spring of this year, we had a bond issue in some school across the state almost every month. That will no longer be the case. So bond issues can only happen at the August primary, the November general election, or in March. Okay, so that will, I don't know if it's better or worse, it'll change planning sort of things just because timing will be different. Another one that also impacts some of the rest of you with your other ones is this one's on CORA and COMA. If you are on a legislative body and you haven't got an update about, especially COMA, the Kansas Open Meetings Act, you probably should. There were some changes there about subcommittees, which could be difficult to do. And then, so any questions about any just on the bills, whether then I'll spend more time on just some budget things.
I've got a question,
Yeah.
and this is going back to students. Okay, do you have any information you're going to show us on where Kansas falls in students? Because right now, we have fell compared to like Mississippi, some of the other states have actually done better with the funding they got. And what I'm seeing is we're spending more money in Kansas for each student compared to, and we've fallen clear to 40-something. And we are spending more money from the facts that I've researched.
So
And,
that was not part of the conversation I was going to have. But
okay.
I don't know where, so everybody looks at different data sets. In general, Kansas is typically about middle of the road in spending, about middle of the road in achievement. Now, Mississippi has done some really good thing with primary education in reading. And actually we're doing some of the same things now. They started early than we are on structured literacy and training in structured literacy. But, I mean, in most things we look at it, Kansas has been at about now. On our own tests, we were seeing decreases in student performance. It kind of bottomed out right around the pandemic again, but we've seen marginal increases the last 3 years in a row, and some of that because of changes that are there. So, but in most things you look at, Kansas is about in the middle, especially if you adjust the spending for cost of living, those kinds of things, and we're pretty much in the middle on most things. But that was not part of what I was going to talk about.
That's fine.
Okay.
I mean, I just see you established a new office,
So that was for early childhood.
early childhood, okay.
Yeah.
So it seems like we're always making more administration positions, and right now, the US has more administrators than we have actual pupils, actual children.
Well,
So I see when you start adding more administrators, there's something that has to give, because they make more money,
right.
the
So
administrators.
I will say we
I
don't
know,
have,
that's not what you're probably talking about.
we
but
don't have anywhere close to 500,000 administrators in the state. We have
Not in the
500,000.
state.
Well, we have 500,000 students. I mean, so
Yeah,
there are hundreds or thousands of students in each district per administrator. Now, in that situation with the Office of Early Childhood, actually what they're trying to do is actually be more efficient. Because early childhood is divided between a little bit in the Department of Education, the KDADS, KDHE. So actually what they're trying to do is bring a lot of administrative functions together, which would be more efficient. So that is the plan. They're going to plan it this year. I don't know what will happen, but it's actually a recognition of when you have these services spread out among a lot of other places, you are less efficient with the administration than if you have it together. So
okay,
that's actually trying to solve a problem that you're bringing up.
okay.
Okay? All right. So now I want to talk about the budget bill. So one of the things that happened was there was a lot of talk about cutting property taxes. And so for those of you who know about how property taxes work, the state has very little to do with property taxes. So they did, actually I'll get to property taxes in a minute, sorry about that. Base state aid in Kansas, which is what each district gets for this one student. Now there's also weightings for things like living in poverty or ELL and transportation, special education. So there are additions to this. But one student, the district will receive $5,615. That will be an increase of $208 million. Now, the way that is figured is it's based on a 3-year average of CPIU. So that's why it went up 4.4%. So if you've been paying attention, you're going to say, well, inflation wasn't anywhere near 4% this year. It's a 3-year average. So we're just getting out 3 years ago of when inflation was 6 and 7%, being back down closer to between 2 or 3%. So those months from 3 years ago are going to fall off, so we're actually expecting about 2.6% to 2.9% next year. Okay? Special education received an additional $10 million, which is a 1.7% increase in state funding. Special education expenses are about $1.2 billion, so that's a 0.6% increase in special education revenue across, and we were not expecting any increases from the federal government as well. So in this, districts will have to spend more of the increase they got in general education with special education, because by state and federal law, you have to provide the special education services that are in a student's IEP, and you can't say we can't afford it. You just have to do it. So that's kind of where the increases were. So some of the things that got eliminated, there used to be for several years on and off, there's been a $5 million grant statewide for safe and secure schools that was eliminated. Some of that money went to the Attorney General's office for funding for a program for AI gun detection software, but we haven't heard anything about that yet. They eliminated $1.8 million in professional development state aid. eliminated teacher stipend. So when you're a brand new teacher, you get an initial license, and you have to have a mentor for 2 years in order to move to a professional license. So there used to be funding that you could pay the mentor teacher $1,000 stipend. That money went away. Districts still have to provide a mentor, but now they decide if they pay them or how much they pay them. And then the next one is Teachers of Excellence. These are, there's a thing called National Board Certification. Teachers can go through a process where they get a National Board Certification. State law requires that districts pay the teacher that has that $1,000 stipend a year, at least $1,000. But now they've taken away the reimbursement for the required stipend. So you can see that there was a big increase, a pretty good sized increase in the base, not enough increase in special education to keep up with costs, and then the elimination of the things. So it's a little bit of a mismatch. Now I will say that when the budget left K-12 budget, it looked better than this. So Representative Smoy was was part of K-12 budget, and it looked better than this. It got to appropriations in the House, and it got through Ways and Means in the Senate, and it didn't look so great. Okay? Higher ed, there's lots of people that could say that the budgets that came out of the budget committees didn't survive. And this is true, not just education, but everywhere. Did not survive appropriation and Ways and Means the way they would have liked to. But when you think about what appropriation and Ways and Means does, is how do we fit what everybody wants into the bucket of money that we want to spend? So that's typically the case. All right, so back to property taxes. So Senate Bill 35 eliminated the statewide 1.5 mill levy. So this is for state institutional buildings. So some of this went to regents and regional colleges. For the Department of Education, what we have to watch for, this also went to the Kansas School for the Deaf and the Kansas School for the Blind. So many of you will know about capital outlay, which is up to an 8 mill levy that districts can levy for capital costs. This is basically what that was for some of these other things, including the School for the Deaf and School for the Blind. So this is one of those things where they said, okay, we're going to use some of the surplus, and we're still going to pay for these things. Anytime you've had a dedicated tax to pay for something that goes away, politicians right away say, yeah, we're going to take care of that. You don't know how far that survives the next election. So that's just something that we have to keep an eye out for the School for the Deaf and the School for the Blind, which I will say have aging facilities that could use some help. The next one was they reauthorized the 20 mills. So you may have heard early in the session, there was a bill in the House that actually would have reduced the 20 mills. So these are the 2 mill levies that the state controls. They reauthorized the 20 mills because the state can't have a mill levy that lasts for more than 2 years. You'll see this on your taxes. The 20 mills actually comes from the school district, because the state law says school districts shall levy 20 mills. That 20 mills goes to the state. It doesn't go to the school district, and then it comes back to the school district as part of that base state aid we talked about. Okay? Now, like the LOB and some of those other things, those goes to the county, and then those go to the school district, and then there's lots of stuff that happens with that. So when the legislature started talking about we're going to lower property taxes, the way they do that is controlling cities and counties. Now, part of lowering the 20 mill levy, they were also going to take a $60 million pot of money, and then they were going to let cities and counties, basically they were going to incent cities and counties to not raise their mill levies, and then you could get some of this money instead. That didn't go anywhere, because they figured out that they couldn't afford to cut the 20 mill levy, because it was going to cost $600 million the first year, and then it just kept going up every year, because the 20 mills goes up every time your valuations go up. And in Kansas, valuations have been going up pretty quick. So you start figuring out how much money that's not bringing in, and they said they couldn't afford it. This is probably some of the same conversations some of you are going through with increased valuations for school districts or cities or counties, saying, how do we balance that? And it's difficult. The Senate Bill 269 was actually another bill that did several things. And so one of them is that it actually will could reduce income taxes but it's tied to the budget stabilization fund, which I think has like $1.8 billion in it now. But if they collect more taxes than they thought they were going to, then they can lower your income tax. So they didn't do a lot for property tax, but they are still working on income tax. The state's major incomes are property and sales taxes, so that's actually where the state can make more difference. If they wanted to make a difference with property taxes, probably what they have to do is increase your sales or income taxes and then supplement property taxes at the local level, because that's where most of those are. And they used to do that. Some of you have been around in local government. They used to do that. This hasn't been funded for a long time. So it's all in a balance. And what I've learned over the time is that the only good tax is a tax that somebody else pays. And so that's just the way it is. I mean, people would like to pay lower taxes and get better services. That's human nature. It just doesn't work budgetarily. All right. So any other questions about legislation? And then I'm going to talk about the Education Funding Task Force, which is a little about the future of education funding. All right. So the Education Funding Task Force. So our current funding formula for schools started in 1992. Okay, it's had some things happen in it. Before that, if you go back to the 70s, all school funding was local. And so what happened over time is that some communities that had big tax bases could have a relatively low levy, raise a lot of money for schools, and have great, pay teachers more, have really beautiful buildings, offer more services and programs, right? So over a series of lawsuits, Kansas school funding has changed. And it's just the fact that the only significant changes in school funding have happened because of lawsuits. For about 30 years, it's only been about 3 years there hasn't been an active lawsuit going on. This is not only Kansas, this happens in all the other states, just kind of depends on how their constitutions are set up. So our current funding, which is called KISA with 2 E's, was passed in 2017 after 2 years of block grants. So while I was in Nebraska, they said, okay, we're going to get rid of the old formula. We're just going to send you the same amount of money for 2 years, and then we're going to fix it. That was in 2017. That formula looks really similar to the old formula that started in 1992. But what they did when they passed that is they said, we're going to put in a sunset. So June 30th of 2017, or 2027, if nothing happens, we don't have a school funding formula, which means there is no legal way to distribute money to schools on July 1 of 2027. Now, that is a self-imposed deadline. They didn't have to put the sunset in. They could just take the date out and everything would go forward. However, when you have something that's been there since 1992 and it's been tweaked by politicians that length of time, things happen that you don't remember why, and sometimes they become more complicated and seem to not be completely fair. So it probably is a good idea to look at it. It's just, how much do you want to change it? So again, they could go from scrapping it and doing something completely different to just get rid of the data. Or probably somewhere in between. So in that, there's this Education Funding Task Force. It has 11 voting members, 6 legislators, a state board member, a parent, a teacher, and 2 superintendents, 1 urban and 1 rural. In case you didn't know, there is not a definition of urban in state law for anything other than water districts. I think it's water districts, might be. So we had to come up with our own definition of urban, and we said you have to have more than 60 students per square mile. And there's about 25 districts like that. So the urban superintendent representative is Corey Gibson, who's in DeSoto, and then the rural one is Brad Newenswander, who's at Jeff West. So both Northeast Kansas people. The state board member is Jim Porter, who is out of the Fredonia area somewhere. All right. So then there are 4 ex officio members, which means we get to talk, but we don't get to vote. and I get to be one of those. And then also the director of special ed for KSDE, the director of the budget, and the director of the children's cabinet. So that's the committee. And this is what the committee is charged with doing. So this is in the law. So the ROSE capacities, I won't spend a lot of time on that, but the ROSE capacities actually came out of Kentucky in a Kentucky school funding lawsuit. And it puts together this list of things that we should aspire for students to be able to do. And some of them are academic, but some of them are more character development things, being a contributing member of society. So it's a list of things that they think would lead to that. And those also now in our state laws, they're incorporated there. It needs to be adequate, consistent, reliable, equitable, and accountable, and there needs to be accountability. Equity is a big part of our current formula, because when you think about, so we talked about, everybody knows what an LOB is, right? Local option budget for the school. So the local school board can levy up to 33% of their general fund as a local levy. But we have this thing called supplemental state aid. And what it does is it equalizes, it pays for part of that LOB depending on the district's average valuation per pupil. The reason being is that some districts could levy that 33% with a 2 mil levy. Somebody else may need a 50 mil levy. And what this does, so that state funding is not additional funding for schools, it's actually property tax equalization. Capital improvement state aid, which goes for bond issues, is the same thing. Districts don't get more money because of it. It's just that the state is paying the property taxes in some areas because of property tax equity. So that's where we get into equity and adequacy. Some of it is equity because of student demographics. If you have more poor students or more special education students, more ELL students, it takes more funding to do that. So that's educational equity. Some of it is also tax equity. And those are both in the formula. So what's happened so far? We've had 5 meetings. The first 2 were pretty short. The last 2 have been a day and a half. And what we've done for the most part is we've looked at the first several meetings were what is our formula, and then what are other states doing? Because one of the things people don't understand is they think, well, every state does it the same way. That is not true. Every state does it at least a little bit to vary differently. And some are good, some are bad, and so you want to look at what the options are. Because if you don't look at what others are doing, it's hard to think about how you can improve your own. So, important conversations. If you want to, all of this information is on the legislative website. You can watch all the hours of it if you want to. You can go through all of the things that come up. But if you're really interested in what happens in other states, there's this website called the Education Commission of the States, and they keep track of education policy in all 50 states, including funding and other things. So you can just go there and say, how does Minnesota fund special education? And you can figure that out. If you're really, really bored, or just something that you find really interesting, but just different ways to do that. So that's how we spent most of the first time. One of the things that's been stated is that this is not a plan to save money. Because you get into this and you talk about, well, we just got out of one lawsuit and out of that, so we're just going to get into another lawsuut. So it was stated earlier, we're not trying to save money. We're just trying to see if we can do this better. And until something comes up, until something's approved, that's, I think, what we have to work with is that's what we're trying to do. So we've been looking at a lot of different models, and so one of the things we do with the models is we say, okay, we're using 24, 25, because we're using, and so we're gonna do everything as if this other model was in place in 24, 25, and then using the exact same amount of money. And then what does it do to schools? One of the things I've been telling schools all summer is that you cannot change the formula and use the exact same amount of money and have everybody come out with the same thing. Doesn't work that way. So if you change the formula, there will be winners and losers. Some will get more, some will get less. What I'm asking you to do is don't look at it that way. Look at it, is this a better way to do it? Because when you look at each of the weightings separately, there'll be winners and losers. if we get something all together, it may kind of even out. And then I can also guarantee that in 27, 28, when this would actually be in place, you won't have those students anyway, so it'll all be different. So this is a way to, we really need to look at this philosophically of, is this the way we want to distribute funding to schools based on students' needs? That's what we're trying to do. So we've looked at a couple of models so far. We looked at high enrollment, low enrollment, at-risk, and bilingual. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on high and low enrollment because this is a question we get a lot. So we have 285 school districts in the state. Last year we had 286. We're expecting to have 284 next year because we have a district that's going to have on their ballot in November whether they disorganize. And so what's happened is that they've become so small that they are no longer viable. And we have a number of them to do that. So one of the things that we do is there's a low enrollment weighting. So as an example, if you have less than 100 students, remember the base I talked about? You actually get 114% of that base for each student. So each student is actually, you get more than twice the base for that student. And the reason for that is that economies of scale are real. If you're a tiny district, it is difficult to make ends meet. What's come up is that we have some districts, one district in particular we use as an example a lot, has 71 students, but it has over 700 square miles. So the question is, how small is too small, but how far away is too far away? So when people think about, we have all these little districts that need to consolidate, that is less of a Western Kansas thing and more of an Eastern Kansas thing. So we'll use Franklin County as an example. How many districts are in Franklin County? So Ottawa's the biggest one, right? What's the smallest one? Yeah. And how far away is it? 15 miles, yeah. I mean, so in Eastern Kansas, we have, and I grew up in Jefferson County, and I think Jefferson County is a better example of this because there are 7 districts that have part of the, at least part of the county, and none of them have 1,000 students. So now you're into the situation where you have districts that are geographically small and have low enrollments, and is that the best thing to do? I don't know. Consolidation has been a terribly unpopular conversation in the legislature. The last time they did it significantly was in 1966, and there was a massive turnover in legislators the next year. And what's happened in the past, so we've talked about low enrollment, and maybe it shouldn't be about low enrollment, maybe it should be about density or sparsity, and it's about how many students are per square mile and all those kinds of things. The problem with politics is, as you start to put those things forward, and some of the folks in those geographically small, low enrollment districts start talking to their legislators, you start losing votes. And then it's like, okay, well, how do we get to something? So I don't know what will happen. But that'll be part of the conversation. High enrollment is a different situation. It's this is one of those things that we can talk about that, and I was in Johnson County for 7 years. It probably came out of Johnson County. There was a, how do we get more money to the big districts without adding to the base? So they said, well, we have this low enrollment. Why don't we add in high enrollment? So any district that has more than 1,622 students gets a 3.5% increase to the base per student. Same amount all the way through. It is more complicated for no apparent reason. You could just take the money out of there and just put it back in the base. You have to reduce low enrollment by the same amount. You distribute the same amount of money based on the same amount of students. So this is one of those things where there are things we could do to simplify the formula. One of the things the committee wants to do is want to keep it as simple as possible. What I tell them, though, is that being simple and fair won't always work. Because simple would be, well, let's just get rid of all the weightings, put it all in the base, and say you get $8,000 per student. Well, if you're Tri-Plains and you have 71 students and 700 square miles, that's not fair. I mean, if you have if you're made up of 90% students that are coming from poverty, that's not fair. So simple and fair Not a good thing. I mean, you have to pick one. Now, you can be as simple as possible and as fair as possible, but you kind of have to figure out where to go in between. That's what the weightings are for. In next month, actually, what was the next one? So one of the things that we're talking about, there's going to be a lot of ideas discussed. So all of these models start with, what if you just eliminate that weighting? And so what I tell districts now, and I tell anybody now, is don't panic. Nothing has been decided. There's not been a single proposal made. It's just looking at things. And it's important for the committee to see what happens if you just take the weighting away, so you understand what impact it has. So what I've been telling districts now is, don't go to your legislature and say, why are you getting rid of low enrollment weighting? We're going to close in 2 years. Nobody's done that yet. You can go to your legislator and say, this is why low enrollment weighting is so important for our community and your constituents. They should be doing that. Because this is going to be a complicated process. And as Representative Schmoy talked about, somebody asked how far through the process it worked. Well, by timeline, they have to have something in January of 2027. So we're halfway through. But in legislative time, we're about 10% through because everything happens at the end. And it happens quickly. And so this is the time to be talking to legislatures about, this is why this is important. And so we have 2 more meetings. The next one is about special education. And then we're going to kind of do a summary. And when that summary comes out, I think that's the time you start talking to legislators about, okay, the committee talked about this. This is why this is important, why it would be a good idea or a bad idea for us. At-risk funding is an easy one. We'll just use some examples there. If you took at-risk funding and just put it back in the base, Blue Valley would love it because they have low percentage of students in poverty. Wichita would lose about $90 million. Okay. So it's, I mean, just one thing doesn't work. It's how do you work that in there. So those are the important parts with that. Okay, so I talked about that. So with that, I'd be happy to take questions, and my practice on questions, you can ask anything you want, I'll decide what I'll answer.
I guess a couple of things. One, just to point to your point on consolidation, we've got 4 school districts in the county, but we've got kids in 11 different districts
Oh, okay.
that live in the county, so that speaks to consolidation from my perspective. But yeah, that's a scary word for some communities.
It is, and I talked to somebody earlier about that, is that when we hear about it, when people like, if you close the school, you're going to kill our town.
Right.
Well, the school's in trouble because the town was in trouble to start with. I mean, the issue is that schools are often the last thing, and so people hold on to them for a lot of reasons. The other reason we see it as an issue is, sometimes communities don't get along. And this is a real story. It's a real story. There was a consolidation that didn't happen because of a 1936 baseball game. That's when the animosity started. And so it's difficult. I mean, I know that growing up in McLeod, there was a representative in McLeod that made sure that the rules were such so McLeod could keep its own district, so that we didn't have to go to school with the kids from Oski.
So you mentioned earlier, the feds didn't release the money until later.
Yeah.
And it sounded like you're still working through how much goes to which district. But the districts are already doing budgeting, so how's that work? And how do we solve that, or how do we help the districts, or help communicate to the public? Because I don't know how you build a budget if you don't know your revenue.
All right, so I'll give you a better example. Federal funds are easy because, they just don't make that much. Districts don't know what they get for special education funding for the year until the 12th month of the budget.
Right.
So you have an estimate all the way through, but you actually get, at the beginning of June, your payment for the year. So that's one of the things about, could we improve the formula? I mean, so we're going to talk about, we only know 4 states that use a partial reimbursement base. And so we can't reimburse until we know what you spent. But that means that you have to have high cash balances because the money that you got in June, you're actually going to use for the first quarter, because now we don't send you a payment again until October. So a lot of this, our districts are used to it, but What we're doing now is, what's your best guess? And what we talk about is, you're going for authority. So, a little high is good. But if you're too high, you're raising taxes you can't spend. Because unlike cities and counties where if we collect the tax, we can spend it, if you get it into LOB and you don't have the authority in LOB to spend it, it just goes into your cash balance. Now, that means that you could lower your levy next year, but what you don't want to do is have your levy jumping up and down like this, because that's just, nobody, then they just think you don't know what you're doing. And there are reasons for that. Then you get large, economic development folks. You do abatements, and people protest those, and you got to figure all that out. So I would say we talk more about in budgeting, there's the science, the art, and the politics. So the science is the accounting. Here's the money. That's where it goes. The art is how do we control mill levies and how do we take that forward. The politics is what can we get approved and how will it be taken from there. So that's what we do. And there's a lot of guessing in it. Okay.
Is there a current bump for the high enrollment students to the base right now? Because I would assume, or what would be the reason for that? That assume essentially economy of scale. Why do they need that?
So there was actually a long explanation in the legislative record, and it had to do with, so there is some theory about once you get too big, it actually gets more expensive. So there's some of that as well. But when it boils down to it was, so it first started, high enrollment started because they felt like when they set the formula and did low enrollment, it wasn't fair to the larger districts. So it was a little bit of, okay, we need to adjust this. They could have added to the base and lowered low enrollment, but they didn't want to do that, so they added high enrollment. So it was a way to spread the money differently. Yeah. But again, it would have been simpler to say, okay, hey, what we need to do is we need to raise the base to get this to work right, but if we raise the base, we can lower low enrollment and they'll still get the same amount of money. So it was a mechanism to tweak how the distribution worked with minimizing the increase to the total that went in. Yeah.
So one of the superintendents, I guess is superintendent for the rules, Jeff West.
Mhm.
But that's kind of an in-between. Have you reached out to any of the superintendents in western Kansas as far, they're the ones starting to feel the demographic shift.
So because that's part of my job as liaison, reached out to all superintendents in the state and asked for volunteers. We had some volunteers, and then the state board selected the person. One of the advantages to Dr. Newenswander and Jeff West is he was formerly the director of school finance at the state. So, and he also then worked at a smaller district, maybe Iola. So he has some experience other places. So, so some of it is his area of expertise and some of his other experiences. Otherwise, I thought the same thing. Is why do we really want to have them from? The other part is, well, if you're close, you can also make the meetings.
That's true.
Frank, is there any conversation in the budget group that we work off of last year's numbers so we know exactly where our budgets are going to be versus making up numbers and not knowing what our budget's going to be until an audit comes around, so we may be working off numbers that truly aren't.
So that's an interesting concept. So currently, districts can use this year's enrollment as of September 20th of 2025, or last year's enrollment, September 20th of 2024. If you're declining enrollment, it's a way to help declining enrollment phase things in. So, as Brian talked about, that means you're guessing what your enrollment's going to be on September 20th. We audit it, and the audits get done about April. So again, just for your general fund, now that one should be close. You should know, because you're gonna guess a little bit, and so you know what's happening with that as it goes through. Now, before 2017, I think that's when it was. Actually that was only 2 years ago that we did that. We were using either last year or the year before. So because the legislature said we need to know what it is so we can budget. And then last year, for some reason, they said, no, we want you to use This year or last year, I don't know why. So actually I do know why. There were some, Spring Hill's an example of a rapidly growing district, and they'd come in and saying, we can't afford this because we've got to hire teachers for all these students and we don't get any money for them until the next year. There are other ways to do that. But yes, they've talked about whether you use average daily membership versus a single count day. If you do average daily membership, you have to use the year before. But you can also build in something if you can demonstrate rapid growth, you can say, okay, we're going to give you this extra here, and then we're going to audit that, and if you didn't get that, we'll make a negative correction or whatever. Yeah. So it's been discussed, not for a while. Other questions?
Would they even, I mean, so with budgeting, would they even look at the dynamics of the classroom itself and teaching way? Would the task force do that, or are they strictly numbers?
So actually, they've talked about so this is an interesting thing is that so there's local control, so districts get to make that decision, but they've actually talked about a weighting for primary grade class size. So basically, if you will keep your primary grade class sizes below this number, then you can get additional money for it, because smaller class sizes cost more because you have to hire more teachers. So it's been talked about. They've also talked about trying to do something with student performance as part of the measure. There isn't another state that does that, so it's like they have to build that model from the beginning, from the base. So that's a difficult thing. It comes into, well, if you're not performing well, will less money help you perform better? There are 2 states that kind of have an incentive where if you meet some benchmarks, they give you extra money. Part of that is like, well, if you're already doing that, do you need, so that's, it goes back to this idea of the theory X, theory Y on just people. You have some people that are just going to do their best no matter what, and some people need a carrot or a stick to do that. My experience, most educators are trying to do the best they can for the students every day. Now, there are things we could do better, but it's not necessarily that whether you provide additional or take funding away is going to change how we're going to try to help students. Now, again, we have some performances. Some of our performance is not good, and we need to improve it. But I don't know that financial incentives are necessarily the best way to do that. So.
Are there other states that are dealing with the shift of demographics and stuff?
Yes. Yeah. There are plenty of states that have a similar issue with small schools, large schools. Really sparsely populated areas. Kansas has that in some areas, but talk about Montana and Wyoming, that's serious. So yeah, we've looked at some of that. So yes, no matter which issue we're looking at, there's at least a couple other states that are dealing with it as well. Actually, poverty is one of those things, and we use free lunch to count to decide what is poverty. Some states use census poverty as opposed to free lunch counts. The issue is that schools get funded based on the number of free lunch students, but you provide services based on students that are at risk based on one of 14 categories. Poverty not being one of them. Now, there is a strong correlation between students living in poverty and some of these other at-risk things. So there's a correlation there, but it's not causal. So, and that's actually one of the big problems in education research is causality, because you can't take a group of students and lock them in a room for a whole year and do something and say, okay, this is what happened. They get to go home to their parents and the community and all those other things, and they're going from class to class. So causality is really difficult in education because you can't. Control groups are difficult. True control groups. Okay.
Have you seen anything with homeschooling, changes in enrollment or anything like that, or has there been any discussion?
So during the pandemic, there was a shift in enrollment. So anything public schools did was too much and not enough, just depending on who you asked. Private schools went through the same thing. So we did see you saw a shift from private to public for people who thought that the privates weren't doing enough, and you saw a shift from public to private or homeschool if they thought the public schools were doing not enough. That's kind of come back a little bit. There is more homeschooling now than there used to be. But the percentages have come back more, have leveled back out since pandemic shifted things a lot, but it's kind of shifted back a little bit more now. And I will say that there are people that do homeschooling really, really well, and it's a great option for their students. Sometimes it doesn't work out so well, but sometimes that was the best option based on what was going on. And we have some outstanding private schools in the state, and if that's the option that parents want, certainly that would be there. With open enrollment, now parents have a lot of public school options as well. And speaking of budgets, I'm supposed to be helping Arc City with their budget in a little bit, so I will probably need to wrap it up.